Good evening, everyone. I think we're ready to begin. My name is Jill Dolan. I'm the Dean of the College at Princeton University, where I'm also honored to be on the faculty of the English Department, the Gender and Sexuality Studies program, and the Theater Studies program in the Lewis Center for the Arts. I'm also quite privileged to serve on Princeton's Public Lectures Committee. I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's event, which is called Money and War, an American Conversation. Our guest speaker is the playwright and novelist Ayad Akhtar, who won the Pulitzer Prize in Drama for his play Disgraced. He's also received an award in literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, among many other critical and institutional accolades. Each of the plays and novels he writes offers us an incisive vision of American and global political and cultural machinations. I recommend them all to you very highly. Ayad's new book, Homeland Elegies, was published in September to critical acclaim and was selected by many outlets as one of the top books of last year. In fact, the New York Times selected Homeland Elegies as a top 10 book of 2020, calling it pitch perfect and virtuosic. I'm personally pleased to welcome Ayad back to Princeton, even in this virtual format. We were just talking a bit before we started about his last visit, which I remember quite fondly. He did a panel for us on campus some years ago when Disgraced was on Broadway, and I so appreciated his eloquent and nuanced conversation about the many sometimes controversial issues addressed by his play. That discussion was one of the highlights of that year on campus, which makes me quite look forward to this panel. I'd also like to welcome our discussants for this evening's conversation. Sadia Abbas is professor of English at Rutgers University, Newark. She is the co-founder and co-editor of Ideas and Futures, which is an interdisciplinary platform that emerged as a response to COVID-19 and focuses on reimagining our societies beyond the pandemic. She's the author of the novel The Empty Room and of the book At Freedom's Limit, Islam and the Postcolonial Predicament, which was a Modern Languages Association First Book Prize winner. Our second discussant is Faisal Devji, who is professor of Indian history and director of the Asian Studies Center at Oxford University. His work focuses on Indian political thought as well as modern Islam. His broader concerns address ethics and violence in a globalized world. His most recent book is Muslim Zion, Pakistan as a Political Idea. Before I turn the virtual podium over to Ayad, I'd like you to know that this event is sponsored by the Princeton University Public Lectures Spencer Trask Lecture Series. The series was founded in 1891 with a gift from Spencer Trask, who is of the class of 1866, for the purpose of supporting public lectures at the university on subjects of current philosophical, artistic, or scientific interest. Our co-sponsors for tonight's event are Labyrinth Books, the McCarter Theater Center, and the Princeton Public Library, as well as Princeton's Lewis Center for the Arts, the Office of the Dean of Religious Life, and the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. I thank each of our co-sponsors for their partnership in providing this platform. Just a couple housekeeping notes. The panelists have kindly agreed to make time at the end of the program for audience questions. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit your question at any time during the event. Also, please know that live captioning is available, so take a moment to turn on this feature now if you'd like to view the captions. And now it's my great pleasure to welcome Ayad Akhtar, who will begin our time together by reading the Overture from Homeland Elegies. Thank you all very much for being with us today. Ayad.
Thanks, Jill. So I'm going to start with a reading from the opening of the book called The Overture. It's Overture to America. I had a professor in college, Mary Maroney, who taught Melville and Emerson, and who the once famous Norman O. Brown, her mentor, called the finest mind of her generation. a diminutive, cherubic woman in her early 30s with a resemblance to a Raphaelesque Puto that was not incidental. Her parents had immigrated from Urbino, a scholar of staggering erudition who quoted as easily from the Eddas and Hannah Arendt as she did from Moby Dick, a lesbian, which I only mention because she did often, a lecturer whose turns of phrase were sharp as a German paring knife, could score the brain's gray matter and carve out new grooves along which old thoughts would reroute, as on that February morning, 2 weeks after Bill Clinton's first inauguration, when, during a class on life under early American capitalism, Mary, clearly interrupted by her own tantalizing thought, looked up from the floor at which she usually gazed as she spoke, looked up and remarked almost offhandedly that America had begun as a colony and that a colony it remained. That is, a place still defined by its plunder, where enrichment was paramount and civil order always an afterthought. The fatherland, in whose name and for whose benefit the predation continued, was no longer a physical fatherland, but a spiritual one, the American self, long trained to worship its desires, however discreet, however banal, rather than to question them, as the classical tradition taught. Ever tumescent American self-regard was the pillaging patria, she said, and the marauding years of the Reagan regime had only expressed this enduring reality of American life with greater clarity and transparency than ever before. Mary had gotten into some trouble the previous semester with similarly bracing remarks about American hegemony in the wake of Desert Storm. A student in the ROTC program taking her class complained to the administration that she was speaking out against the troops. He started a petition and set up a table in the student union. The brouhaha led to an editorial in the campus paper and threats of a protest that never actually materialized. Mary wasn't cowed. After all, this was the early 90s, and the consequences of astringent ideological fire and brimstone or sexual abuse of power while you're at it were hardly what they are today. If anyone had a problem with what she said that afternoon, I didn't hear about it. The truth is, I doubt many of us even understood what she was getting at. I certainly didn't. Worship of desire, tumescent self-regard, a colony for pillage. In her words was the power of a great negation, a corrective to a tradition of endless American self-congratulation. It was new to me. I was accustomed to the God bless light of the world exceptionalism that informed every hour I'd ever spent in history class. I'd come of age in the era of the hilltop city, gleaming for all to see. Such were the glorified tropes I learned at school, which I saw not as tropes, but truth. I saw an American benevolence in Uncle Sam's knowing glare at the post office, heard an American abundance in the canned laugh tracks on the sitcoms I watched every night with my mother, felt an American security and strength as I pedaled my 10-speed Schwinn past split level and 2-story homes in the middle class subdivision where I grew up. Of course, my father was a great fan of America back then. To him, there was no greater place in the world, nowhere you could do more, have more, be more. He couldn't get enough of it. Camping in the Tetons, driving through Death Valley, riding to the top of the arch in St. Louis before hopping a riverboat down to Louisiana to fish for bass in the bayou. He loved visiting the historic sites. We had framed our photos of trips to Monticello and Saratoga and to the house on Beale Street in Brookline where the Kennedy brothers were born. I recall a Saturday morning in Philadelphia when I was 8 and father scolding me for whining through a crowded tour of rooms somehow connected to the Constitution. When it was over, we took a cab to the famous steps at the museum and he raced me to the top, letting me win in homage to Rocky Balboa. Love for America and a firm belief in its supremacy, moral and otherwise, was creed in our home, one my mother knew not to challenge, even if she didn't quite share it. Like both Mary's parents, as I would later learn from Mary herself, my mother never found in the various bounties of her new country anything like sufficient compensation for the loss of what she'd left behind. I don't think mother ever felt at home here. She thought Americans materialistic and couldn't understand what was so holy about the orgy of acquisition they called Christmas. She was put off that everyone always asked where she was from and never seemed bothered that they had no idea what she was talking about when she told them. Americans were ignorant not only of geography, but of history too. And most troubling to her was what she thought connected to this disregard of the important things, namely the American denial of aging and death. This last irritation would yield a malevolent concretion over the years, a terror-inducing bête noire that saw her to her grave. The thought that growing old here would mean her eventual sequestering and expiration in a home that was nothing like one. My mother's views, however rarely voiced, should have prepared me to understand Mary's dyspeptic take on this country, but they didn't. Not even my Islam prepared me to see what Mary saw, not even after 9/11. I remember a letter from her in the months following that terrifying day in September that changed Muslim lives in America forever, a 10-page missive in which she encouraged me to take heart, to learn what I could from the trouble ahead, confiding that her struggles as a gay woman in this country, the sense of siege, the unceasing assaults on her quest for wholeness, the roughness of her route to autonomy and authenticity, that all these had been but fires beneath her crucible, provoking creative rage, tempering sentimentality, releasing her from hope in ideology. Use the difficulty, make it your own, was her admonition. Difficulty had been the flintstone against which her powers of analysis were sharpened, the how and why of what she saw, but which I still wouldn't truly see with my own eyes for 15 years to come, my deepening travails as a Muslim in this country notwithstanding. No, I wouldn't see what Mary saw until I'd been witness to the untimely decline of a generation of colleagues, exhausted by the demands of jobs that never paid them enough, drowning in debt to care for children riddled with disorders that couldn't be cured, and the cousins and the best friend from high school who ended up in shelters or on the street, tossed out of houses they could no longer afford, and until the near dozen suicides and overdoses of 40-something childhood classmates in a mere space of 3 years, and the friends and family medicated for despair, anxiety, lack of affect, insomnia, sexual dysfunction, and the premature cancers brought on by the chemical shortcuts for everything from the food moving through our irritable bowels to the lotions applied to our sun-poisoned skins. I wouldn't see it until our private lives had consumed the public space, then been codified, foreclosed, and put up for auction, until the devices that enslave our minds had filled us with the toxic flotsam of a culture no longer worthy of the name, until the bright pliancy of human sentience, attention itself, had become the world's most prized commodity, the very movements of our minds transformed into streams of unceasing revenue for someone, somewhere. I wouldn't see it clearly until the American self had mastered the plunder, idealized and legislated the splitting of the spoils, and brought to near completion the wholesale pillage, not only of the so-called colony, how provincial a locution that seems now, but also of the very world itself. In short, I wouldn't see what she saw back then until I'd failed at trying to see it otherwise, until I'd ceased believing in the lie of my own redemption, until the suffering of others aroused in me a starker, clearer cry than any anthem to my own longing. I read Whitman first with Mary. I adored him. The green leaves and dry leaves and spears of summer grass, the side-curved head, ever avid for what came next. My tongue too is homegrown. Every atom of this blood formed of this soil, this air. But these multitudes will not be my own, and these will be no songs of celebration. That's the overture.
There we go. Thank you for that, Ayad. Thank you, Jill, Julia, Chris, for the invitation, and Daniel for the invitation and for the magnificent preparations for this. It's been very inspiring to see how organized everyone is, and a little envy-inducing because I work at a state school. You know, I've been asked to sort of manage a little bit also the conversation that's going to ensue, but start with some reflections. I am a post-colonialist, and I will think about Ayad's book for a few minutes with you from that perspective, but also as I'm a post-colonialist who's a literary professor. So. You know, one of the things that I think is so important about Homeland Elegies, of which I have to say I am a great admirer, and read it in one go when I received a copy in the mail as a lovely gift, is that it's doing something for post-colonialists. And by doing something to the post-colonial novel, right, which is that it's in the Anglophone tradition, the post-colonial novel has been very largely focused on England and the Commonwealth, and America has not fully been part of the conversation. both in the novel, but also in postcolonial studies. As postcolonialists, we have, and I recently called for this at the American Comparative Literary Association panel at the Modern Language Association, we have not enfolded America into our thinking, despite the resurgence of empire after 9/11, about which, or after 1989, not that empire ever went away, let me take that back, but after the explicit resurgence of empire after 9/11. What's wonderful about Homeland Elegies then is that the way in which it brings together those two things, right? This kind of post-colonial history of the novel and in the novel, and America also in the novel. And I don't just mean in Homeland Elegies, I mean in the novel as a form. By, of course, beginning with a reference to Herman Melville, that great thinker of and great writer about racialized capitalist modernity and the formation of America around it. And it's been a particularly rewarding to think about this as I've been teaching. In fact, I started teaching this week Billy Budd. So it's, sort of Melville is very much on my brain, or in my mind rather. And then there's also the allusion to Whitman and lyric, right? And as a form, and the lyricism of the novel itself, which and I might want to talk about this later, refuses what has come to seem the very narrow model of contemporary writing that's emerging out of the Iowa Writers' Workshop. So there's a kind of giving up on the possibilities of the great baggy novel, which I do think Homeland Elegies is as well. It is in the tradition of the great American baggy novel. In the service of accessibility, which I have come increasingly, and this is the Iowa model, I've come increasingly to just see as a different form of commodification, right? That it's easier to commodify the novel if it is accessible, it sells more copies, and people say that explicitly. There's something I'm not talking about right now, but we have had a conversation about this on Ideas and Futures, the platform I did, between Ayad, Shazia Sikandar, and Arya Judy. And Arya Judy, sort of brought up the references or the kind of engagement with Ralph Ellison in the novel around the question of race, but maybe we can come back to that later. So there are two allusions in the overture that I just mentioned, one to Melville and then the other to Whitman. There's a third one, and that brings together the post-colonial as well. And I don't know how conscious it was for Ayad, but it's certainly there, and I heard it. And that's in the last line when which says, "Every atom of this blood formed of the soil, this air, but these multitudes will not be my own." So there's obviously the kind of critique of, or the implicit play on this notion of the blood and soil nation. But there's also an echo there, which I think is very significant, given that Salman Rushdie comes up in the novel itself, in the rest of the novel. And that's to the end of Midnight's Children. And I will read you the part of the conclusion, of the concluding sentence. "It is the privilege and curse of Midnight's Children to be both masters and victims of their times, to forsake privacy and be sucked into the annihilating whirlpool of the multitudes, and to be unable to live or die in peace." So that brings me then to the two words of the title, Homeland and Elegies, right? Because of course, Homeland both manages to pun on imaginary homelands, or sort of, at least for me as a post-colonialist, echoes with Salman Rushdie's famous essay, Imaginary Homelands, which was very important for me as an undergraduate. And I remember reading it over and over again and being kind of dazzled by it, and taking the copy around and bugging my teachers because I kept quoting it. And of course, that dreadful show, Homeland, the 9/11 show, which is, I don't know if it's deliberate, but again, this terrible show, which is all about the problems of racial profiling and Muslims and the war on terror and everything that happened after 9/11 to Muslims. So there's Homeland right there, right? And there's the elegy, which is the funeral song, which of course refers back to Whitman, but also what is it a funeral song for? Right? Or what is it announcing the death of? Right? So on the one hand, I think it's wonderful because it's also rescripting the immigrant novel as a form by refusing a certain kind of angst of the second generation immigrant. So there's plenty of angst in the novel, but it's not the question of belonging in the usual diasporic sense, right? I mean, that I think is given over. And, if I had more time, I think about it more carefully or less telegraphically, but I think is given over to the father. And in that sense, the idea of Homeland dies in one sense, but then comes back in another because he goes home and America can't become the homeland. But there's also this notion of what does homeland mean for the second generation immigrant? So as an immigrant novel, I think, right, or as an immigrant novel that refuses to be a properly immigrant novel, I think everything hinges on this question of redemption, where he says that I ceased believing in the lie of my own redemption. And for me, that has always been, it kind of resonates with a thought I've had for a long time, and that I brought up in relation to Shazia Sikandar's work. And Shazia, of course, has been in conversation with Ayad over time and all kinds of work, but which is what I call the American romance of immigrant redemption, which is the way in which an embrace of the immigrant allows America to forget its own racial history and to use essentially a 1965 wave of immigration that came out of Black struggle in many ways, right? And enabled by Black struggle during the civil rights. But that embrace, that ostensible embrace, is then used to, sort of somehow redeem American history. I mean, look, we're so good to the immigrants, we must be good after all. And that notion of redemption is, of course, completely tied up with Winthrop's notion of the city of the hill, all of which is there in the Overture, which I think is why I sort of couldn't put down the book when I read the Overture as the book arrived in the mail. I just opened it and I was like, oh, do I have to? And I started reading it and I couldn't put it down because all of this is in play. So I think that as an immigrant novel, it really does rewrite a kind of post-colonial diasporic narrative, and by not being an immigrant novel in any proper sense that I recognize, and it becomes instead a novel about America as a whole, and America's extraordinarily violent history, which is there in all kinds of ways, marked both by Melville and Whitman, who and Whitman's own antebellum history, but and his views around the Civil War. And in fact, I'm thinking of Melville's magnificent poem "Reconciliation," which I teach, but also it's about America as a sort of and its capitalist, as it kind of inhabits its own or accepts and exacerbates its own capitalist formation in this latest phase of capitalism and the financialization that we've been witnessing, which is accompanied precisely, this kind of death of a certain kind of American possibility, which is very much mentioned in the Overture as well, and which had a lot to do with Trump's election, I think, right? So the novel takes that 9/11 moment, and which is not its inaugural moment at all, but in fact absorbs it into this longer history of race, capital, and immigration, and produces a very, very different meditation on America through that lens. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to hand this over to Faisal, who has thoughts, and then we'll sort of follow a free-flowing format.
Thanks very much, Sadia. I have to say, I'm not as repulsed by the series Homeland as you are, in part because it's obviously an interesting symptom of American popular culture, but also because I can't get my fill of Carrie. You know, how can she possibly be on edge all the time? But maybe that too is a part of the America that Ayad's novel so wonderfully explores. But let me pick up on what you said about the Immigrant Novel, because you know what struck me the moment I began reading Homeland Elegies was how it breaks the mold of the Immigrant Novel. If we take the Immigrant Novel as being a form that preeminently is about a struggle of contending loyalties, the new world, the old world one has left, or of negotiated identities, in which some kind of fit is sought within a context that is always given. Certain things may change about it, but generally its parameters are given. And Ayad's novel doesn't do this at all, if I'm correct. And it reminded me, you know, when I was, and I just wonder whether this has something to do with the great alteration of racial politics we have seen recently, and with which the novel also deals. Now, of course, there's a kind of trickery of history here, because the novel was written and published before the recent US elections. But now that we have had them, it's impossible to look back upon it without taking those elections into consideration. And it's in those elections and in their aftermath that the issue of race has become politically central in a way that it hasn't perhaps been so ostentatiously for a while. And one reason I suspect the novel is not an immigrant novel in this sense is because it seems to illustrate the breakdown of an old racial order. I remember when I left the US for Britain 12 years ago, a friend of mine in New York said to me, this is the difference between the racial order in the US as opposed to the UK. In America, if you're not Black, you're white. And in Britain, if you're not white, you're Black, which is why in Britain, you can have something like a Black political identity that brings together different immigrant groups. There is no population of slave descent in the UK in the same way there is in America. Whereas in the US, non-white immigrants who are not African-American have had the possibility, at least, of fitting into various levels of whiteness for a long time. I wonder, given what we have been seeing in the last number of months, indeed in the last 4 or 5 years, whether that nice distinction no longer works. I wonder whether the new immigrant, soon to be majority in some ways, is unassimilable to the old race politics of Black versus white. And is that why we have seen in recent events in the United States, which I of course observed from afar, the strange presence of the non-white immigrant in the riots at the Capitol, among voters for Trump, including Muslim voters. NPR tells us that between 17 to 34% of Muslims, of non-African American Muslims in America, voted for Trump. In the leadership of the Proud Boys, but also perhaps in the emergence of non-African American persons at the very height of American political life. A friend of mine once told me that President Obama, though he was constantly being assailed by Trump even before Trump became president on the issue of his of birtherism, the fact, the presumed fact that he was not born in the United States or that he was Muslim, that actually worked for him. It worked for him because Obama was therefore seen not as an African American, but as an immigrant in some fashion. One might perhaps say the same of Kamala Harris today. The way in which the non-white immigrant, as it were, takes the place of the African American after, for so many decades, actually, and this goes back to what you were saying earlier, Sadia, pushing the African American further out, beyond the acceptable realms of political and cultural life. So I'm left wondering whether Homeland Elegies, insofar as it's not an immigrant novel, is not an immigrant novel precisely because something really major has changed, and that the old novel of assimilation and contending loyalties is no longer possible because you have the non-white immigrant on both sides of the political fence in the United States. And insofar as they're on both sides of the American fence, the black and white racial politics of the past might be at its last moment. Is that why perhaps we see its apparent reemergence in the way it's been happening before us on television screens for months, if not years now?
Ayad, do you want to respond to what we've said, or should we take it that way?
Sure, I'm taking it in. I mean, it's I'm particularly taking these last comments that Faisal you just made about the fundamental shift in American life, or the racial politics, or the composition of racial politics within political power, as somehow signaling a change that I may have been somatizing or digesting without even sort of understanding it. I'm sort of just thinking that through now as I've heard it. And of course, Sadia, I mean, everything that you outlined is, was part of what I was swimming in as I was writing the book, and it's obviously so gratifying to be read, which is a very simple thing, but seems to be increasingly hard to come by these days, as you and I discussed. So yeah, I mean, I don't have any specific comments about those, other than to say I'm struck by them, and I think they're both provocative, and I think probably very deeply true. So
I want to, if I may, ask Faisal to say something about the 9/11 novel as well, right? Where 9/11 is a little bit more in this, right? Because I think that's Faisal, we've talked about this in the past as well. I mean, you have some very intriguing things to say about that. I mean, but before I get there, I do want to say that I think that, Faisal has put his finger in something, and I've been feeling this more and more, even in the conversation that we had publicly with you, that I had with you and Shazia Sikandar, right? Because it also seems to me, and it's actually one of the reasons that I put together the Ideas and Futures Collaborative, partly because it seems to me that one of the things that even this election has exposed is a kind of not so much the unintelligibility, but the actual meaninglessness of the demographic shift as it is usually invoked, not as Faisal's invoking it here, but as it's invoked, right? And of course, one way of thinking about it is that, Harry Kondabolo's hilarious, what was it, 2042 skit. I don't know if people have seen it, but if you haven't, I would recommend that you go see it, where he talks about where there's this whole rip of, the supposed demographic shift where we're all of us immigrants and all people of color will somehow unite, right, into some block, despite all of the, sorry, my desk is collapsing on me, but despite all the tensions between the various communities, right? But at the same time, I think that, and along with that, I mean, it seems to me that, you know, the punditocracy will say that it's just the demographic shift will come and everything will change. Right? But what's not, it seems to me, fully underway at the same time, and you know, one of the reasons that I was so eager to have this conversation with Ayad, though, you know, in so many different venues, was that it seems to me that we need to address this, and the novel is one of the places, one of the texts that enables us to start thinking about this, is that we've got to rethink the very nature of the polity, right? Because what is that demographic shift? What is this demographic shift going to actually consist of? Like, how are we going to all live together nonetheless, right? What is, and that I think is a question for us globally at the moment, right? What, I mean, I was talking about this earlier to Ari Judy, who, you know, why does BLM resonate with a truck driver in Pakistan, for instance, you know, who did that wonderful portrait? And so at some level, I think what's at stake is, what is the nature of the state in neoliberal capital, right? And what's the way out? And in neoliberal capital defined by catastrophic climate change, you know, so as extinction is now the horizon, right? So what's polity going to look like? So demographic shift there is, it just becomes some kind of cipher for, oh, well, white people won't rule the world anymore.
I mean, I think, you know, absolutely. And I think that one of the paradoxes of the book is that the two sort of portraits of politics of what, you know, men of color in the book, you know, the father in the book and Mike Jacobs, both men of color, they both talk politics, their political identities are, and they're both Trump voters. And which is, you know, which is an inversion. I mean, it was not necessarily a conscious inversion. The portraits that I was drawing from the original articles, you know, there was some resonance there, but I think it does speak to a kind of, you know, we talk about the demographic shift as if there is some sort of at least ideological utopia ahead of us, that once that demography changes, that everything's going to be fine. But I think what we're looking at, and you can see it in the recent work of Charles Blow, for example, who's beginning to articulate a kind of balkanization, I think, of the country along the lines of racial identity. And what that means in terms of where we're headed might be considerably more complicated and maybe darker than we recognize, which is, I think, one of the sort of, you know, it's one of the undertow melodies of the book, is that all is not well. And Donald Trump is not the reason all is not well.
Yeah. Faisal, also the 9/11 point that got.
Yeah, I wonder, you know, perhaps, Ayad, do you have a kind of 9/11 passage perhaps you might want to read, and then we can talk about it?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. You know that I do because we prepared it. Okay, so this is later in the book, the narrator, who has my name and many of the facts of my life, but is not exactly me. I know that people don't believe that, but it's true. Is having a romantic involvement with another Pakistani American-born Pakistani woman, and the subject turns to 9/11, and he starts telling the story of what happened to him on that day. So I'm just going to read from the beginning of it. He says, "Back then I had a TV in my bedroom, and the first thing I would do when I got up was turn it on for the weather. That morning, though, I remember they were showing a live feed of a fire in the upper floors of the first tower. The announcers kept saying a small plane had hit the tower, and I remember thinking as I went into the bathroom of JFK Jr.'s plane going down in the Atlantic Ocean. I was putting toothpaste on my toothbrush when I heard someone cry out on the television. I went back into the bedroom and saw there'd been a new explosion. Another plane had hit the tower. I knew right then. I don't know how I knew, but I did." "Knew what?" Asha asked. "That it was us, that we did this." She was quiet, but her guarded look wasn't hard for me to read. If I was cannier, dear reader, I would recast that expression on her face, offer an airbrushed look of offense as prelude to a vociferous objection on her part, then follow it all with a concocted back and forth that made clear her Muslim horror over the attacks, no different in kind from that of any non-Muslim. If I cared less about it all, I would write it that way to save myself the likely grief ahead. But I won't write it that way because that's not what happened. She didn't speak because, like me, she was used to the sermons and family dinners replete with complaint about murderous American meddling, worry over Muslim land and lives lost, praise of Hitler and rage against Israel, self-reproach about the pathetic state of our own imperial destiny. Like me, she'd heard many times that a figure would rise among us to overthrow the illegitimate rule of these Europeans and neo-Europeans, that we were destined to take the world back from these spiritual ghosts one day. They turned their back on God for money, and we knew that could only end badly. They were a category of human with no measure beyond themselves. They honored nothing. It was no surprise the very planet itself was dying under their watch of their short-sighted empire. The day would come when we would take it all back and restore to it a rightful holiness. She'd heard it all so many times, though we would both hear it less and less after the attacks. She looked away now with the subtlest of discouraged nods, the expression on her face, I thought, charged with chagrin. No, it goes on, but I'm not going to keep going on. So.
Yeah, no, I just want to, perhaps, let the audience know, those of them who haven't read your book yet, that 9/11 is incredibly powerfully portrayed in it, except as Sadia was saying earlier, it's somewhat tangential, nevertheless, to the book, yet it radiates meaning throughout it, in all of it. And I just thought, just in the way that I suspect you're breaking the immigrant novel, here too, you're breaking something that doesn't even quite exist, in the sense that I don't think there has been a successful 9/11 novel, and I don't think that's accidental. Because if you conceive of such a novel, either as beginning, Sadia was telling us, with the event, or as somehow leading up to the event. We have had novels of this kind, but I don't see any of them as being, and they certainly haven't been bruited forth as being, the novel of this particular event. And neither will yours, but not because 9/11 doesn't play an extraordinary role in it, but because it deliberately, it seems to me, sidelines it, while yet letting it become meaningful for the rest of, for all the characters in your novel. And I wonder whether this is because, I think the philosopher Jacques Derrida said so at the time, that 9/11 remains mysterious. It doesn't even have a name of its own. It's called 9/11. It's a kind of a numerical form of dating, abbreviated at that. And perhaps this is why it has so far been a literary failure. A friend of mine, Leslie Dunton Downer, wrote shortly, not so long after 9/11 itself, a very interesting piece on how 9/11 has the only literary achievement it has resulted in is the 9/11 report, which is, of course, a government report, which you will recall became an enormous bestseller, the only such report ever to become a bestseller. And she pointed out how interesting it was that the report was constructed like an epic. The funny thing about America and American history, and there's so much of it in your book, Ayad, is that neither the Revolution nor the Civil War, which you would think are truly instances of epic, have received epic treatment in literary terms. They have received a lot of treatment, of course. But there is no great epic, to my mind, of either the Revolution or the Civil War. But 9/11 does have an epic, if only the 9/11 report, in which the event nevertheless remains mysterious. And like an epic, it begins in medias res. It follows the literary conventions, Leslie pointed out, to an epic. But again, one at whose heart remains a whole, a mystery. We can't quite figure out what happened, why people did what they did. And in your book, Ayad, I just think that, also in the passage you just read out, that mystery is located in the figure of Islam and of Muslims, American Muslims, and others around the world. And it made me think how, since perhaps Rushdie, Sadia mentioned the Rushdie affair over the satanic verses, I was a student at the time at Berkeley, And I remember Cody's bookshop was bombed, which I, along with many other people who were bibliophiles, narrowly missed that bombing. But how since Rushdie, Islam has come to represent, if you will, the threat of the global. And you see this in current America in terms both of the so-called Muslim ban recently revoked, but also of the fence, the Mexican fence. You know, how are we going to actually close off this country? Not, I think, to a specific group of people. Already with the fence and the Muslim ban, you see there's no one group of people. But if you will, to the global itself, which can no longer be dominated in the post 9/11 world. And what strikes me about this situation, but also how Islam and Muslims appear in your novel, is that there is no specificity to it, in the sense that, unlike, say, anti-Semitism, where the figure of the Jew is linked historically and prejudicially to the transnational reach of capital, and therefore linked to unhomeliness, to non-belonging, etc., all of those things that we cosmopolitanism, etc., or for that matter, communism, which is linked to capital in another way as its potential destroyer. With Islam and Muslims, there is no serious link of that kind. And so it seems to me to be a kind of floating signifier. People talk about Islamophobia as if it were something that has existed for generations and generations and perhaps even centuries. I'm not sure, because it seems to me to be a discontinuous history. When you think about in early immigration, whether to the UK or elsewhere in Europe or to the US by Muslims, they were not necessarily, certainly in Britain, even known as Muslims, even though they had been known as Muslims in the colonies that Britain had once controlled. They were suddenly defined in national or racial terms as Pakistanis or as Asians or whatever. The term Muslim, the identity Muslim, only comes really to become important again in the 1980s, after the Iranian Revolution, and certainly after the Rushdie affair. So it's a discontinuous history. And I think perhaps that's why every time there are attacks on Muslims, there are people who apparently look like Muslims, generally Sikhs, who are attacked as if by mistake. I don't think this is a mistake. I think the category Muslim is too diffuse and is not linked, attached firmly to any particular narrative of discrimination, to be identified in the way that anti-Semitism identifies its targets. And I just wonder if does that make sense in terms of the very passage you read, Ayad, about who is responsible, who's the we, and how can it be separated from the they? It seems to me that a lot of this sort of churning has to do with the non-specificity of victimhood and blame.
Just to respond very briefly to that, which is a series of brilliant reflections. I think that one of the dilemmas of the book, in writing the book and maybe inhabiting the consciousness that brought it into being, was the dilemma of trying to make sense of that floating referent. Because what does that floating referent do to the subjectivity of the one who has to constantly account for it? And that there might be reference in your own history or your family's history that help you to make some sense of some part of it, whether that history goes all the way back to the Crusades or whatever, some longstanding antagonism to other monotheistic traditions that, I personally believe Islam is suffering from an anxiety of influence with relation to those things, whatever, that's beside the point. But the subjectivity that's constantly being forced to make sense of the non-specificity of the way that it is seen. And adding, the truculence and the danger to that. But yeah, no, I totally agree.
Well, and I think that what's also really, I wrote a book about this question, I think, but it's or not, but it's still interesting from a different angle, right? Because one of the things that 9/11 brought to the fore, and or rather Trump brought to the fore, but also to some extent 9/11 as well, brought to the fore was there were all of these contestations between Muslims, even in America, right? So between Black Muslims, for instance, not just Nation of Islam, but like, you know, sort of Orthodox Sunni Black Muslims, and then Arab and Pakistani or South Asian immigrants, Muslim immigrants who came and in some cases pushed many of the Blacks out of their mosques, right? I mean, that also happened. And it's a history that's not yet fully been thought through. But at the same time, after 9/11, right? And then even more after Trump, there was this idea that, well, wait a minute, we have to embrace, you know, this big tent Muslim identity, and suddenly we were standing behind our Black Muslim brethren, because they were like, you know, they could claim a kind of indigeneity, whatever indigeneity means in America for anybody other than the natives, right? That we could, and so there was this, and some of it was quite opportunistic, right, within certain communities as well. Although now we know that 1/3 of the slaves who were brought in were, in fact, Muslims. Like, I mean, those are the current estimates. So in some sense, it's always interesting because, of course, it is the threat of the global, right? It's also the way in which America assimilates the global through its racial structures, because whenever, even within these demographic non-white circles, when I'm talking about these things, right, when I try to bring in the international as opposed to the global, right, so I'm making a kind of political distinction here between the progressive versus, you know, just the neoliberal, people will say, well, you know, we've got everyone here, you know, as if this sort of like, if we can, just because we can get Vietnamese and sushi at the same space, in the same space, we've somehow resolved some kind of fundamental, you know, relationship with the world, right? And then we put up walls, right? Whatever that means. I mean, so and I don't think it's accidental that in this current moment that, you know, I mean, it was an inevitability of capital, of course, but at the moment when labor becomes irrelevant and people have always been disposable anyway, so certainly non-white people and certainly slaves, suddenly capital is the only thing that can move, and people are all supposed to stay home, right? So that was always the case. Now it's completely the case. So within that, of course, I mean, the referent has to shift, right? Because the only thing that apparently exists is whiteness, whatever that is, right? And capital. Like, those are the two things. And maybe, I mean, I would imagine that Faisal's going to say, well, whiteness doesn't exist either. And of course it doesn't at some level, right? But I'm thinking of Du Bois as The Souls of White Folk, which I taught last semester, where he's talking about, and maybe this is a little digressive, but I want to connect it back, where he's talking about a decolonization, right? And he's talking about the Wilsonian moment. And of course, since we're at Princeton, I think, and the whole controversy about the Woodrow Wilson Center and the name and all of that, it's appropriate to talk about Wilson. But the Wilsonian moment, which is ostensibly about national sovereignty, right? And Du Bois is sort of warning, right, the people of the world that, you know, in the shift from the colonies to the supposedly anti-colonial non-colony empire, which is the United States, you know, you're making a mistake if you embrace this Wilsonian ideal, right? So the question then precisely becomes, you know, what is the space in which we all exist now, right? And what is that polity going to be? And where does Islam fit into it? I mean, Islam has been very, you know, Muslim countries have been part of the capitalist imperium, right? I mean, part of what we're living through has as much to do with 1973 and OPEC, right, as it does with anything else. So this identity that we've all sort of, you know, I guess this is sort of my concluding thought on this, and I'm thinking on my feet, and my desk is still collapsing as I say this, which is that, you know, part of the power of America is that it forces people to inhabit identities as grievance. And I was having this conversation with Fred Moten and Arya Judy the other day, and John Keane as well, right? Which is that, and that goes back, I think, to the Pilgrims, right? That there's always a threat, that we're fleeing the threat. And grievance is fundamental to the constitution of selfhood, right? We talk about capital in the American South. The American South is consuming, but it is also aggrieved, right? And we've seen that recently in our white stormtroopers at the Capitol as well, right? Grievance is all. So I think that in order to be part of the American discourse and dialectic, one has to, or one is invited to inhabit grievance as identity formation, right? And so when in 9/11, Islam provides a certain, the persecution of Muslims and the persecution of racial minorities is always there, right? In America, the persecution of racial minorities, not of Muslims. Muslims get added after in the 80s and after the Iranian Revolution, not necessarily as Muslims at that point, but slowly after TWA, the hijacking as well as Muslims. I mean, it's an accumulative process that gets consolidated in 9/11. But there's this, you use concretion in another context, right? But there's a concretion of identity that America demands, right? And at the same time, that concretion is, of course, has no grounding, right? I mean, I think that's what Faisal is pointing out. So we're stuck with that problem. And I think that Homeland Elegies is addressing that problem in a very particular, right? Or blowing it up in a very particular way, which is probably the wrong thing to say, given the context, but still. But I think so. Does that make sense? And I think then we should open it up to the audience.
No, it totally does, and it brings me to mind of the thing that you started us out with, which is Melville, and the way in which one of the things that I think that I'm trying to do with the book is to depict the process in which, as you say, things get digested here through commerce, or they get digested here through the market. And that's the right. But the thing that you're also saying is that there is a deeper emotional history, which is identification of yourself as other and then leaving someplace and coming here. And not just the economic prosperity, but the promise of economic prosperity, but the fleeing of some danger. And interestingly enough, I mean, 9/11 maybe is one of the great instances, or the only real instance, of foreign threat that everyone is fleeing elsewhere finally showing up on our shores, and which is why perhaps it's been so hard for the American imagination to fully digest this. I think Lacan once said that trauma is the thing that happens because we don't have the language to articulate it. That's the nature of trauma. The trauma is not the actual event, it's the fact that we can't process it in language. And in a sense, we still don't have the language for 9/11. Not because it doesn't exist. I'm not sure that it's an instance of what Badiou would call an event, that is to say, something that has no precedent, which comes into being. It's that the American historical imagination is so limited, and I don't say that as a criticism, I just say that as an observation, that we're still very young. So we still don't have the tools to fully make sense of our history.
Well, I think that's a perfect segue into a question that was posed in the Q&A, which is, how can literature, how can literature contribute to this demographic shift, or this demographic conversation, right? I mean, can it? And I'll turn that over to Ayad, and then.
I mean, I'm not a huge believer in American faith in art. as, as anyone who's read the book knows, I mean, I think I'm always quoting Emerson, who in 1834 said, "Why can't a man sit down to think in this country without somebody asking if he's got a headache?" Whitman also bemoaned or believed that artists could contribute to the national discourse in a way that would galvanize opinion nationally. I think if Shelley's right and we have poets and legislators who are unacknowledged, poets and philosophers are unacknowledged legislators, then our poets and philosophers are Jay-Z, Beyonce, the Kardashians, and Donald Trump. It is the purveyors of content, the self-styled, self-appointed, and self-promoting storytellers who are monetizing the process of narrative. Those are the ones who are shaping comportment and the way that people think. And so I'm not a big believer that literature has a huge purchase on the American psyche, which doesn't mean I don't think it's important or that it's not valuable. I do think it is, but maybe not as a collective force, maybe something that moves the individual to a different level of absorption.
Faisal, do you have anything to say about that?
Well, as a mere historian, I can't really speak about art, except to say that it's always struck me that, what Ayad was saying about Beyonce, etc., and even Trump, I think is entirely to the point, because it seemed to me always that there's been a suspicion of anything that smacks of elitism and it's a result of American democracy. It's a result of a good thing, so these are the inadvertent consequences of a good thing. Whereas, of course, since I moved from back and forth between the UK and the US, I see this difference more and more clearly, that novels, art, literature, you don't have to be apologetic about them in public forums or in public life. And that, God forbid, you can even quote and cite them and have allusions and things like that. So, in a way, it's the problem of democracy. It's a good problem to have in many respects.
I'm going to actually, I've changed my view on that. I don't actually think it's about democracy. I'm going to push a little there. And I want to say, before I get there, I want to, one of my favorite lines in the Overture, right, is, until the bright pliancy of human sentience, attention itself had become the world's most prized commodity, the very movements of our minds transformed into streams of unceasing revenue for someone somewhere. I wouldn't see it clearly until the American self had fully mastered the plunder, right? Which I think speaks to precisely what you're talking about, right? The bright pliancy of human sentience, right? Which is, I actually think it has everything to do with capital, not with democracy, right? With the nature of American capital. I also think it has to do with something else. And this, I've been marking, and I'm teaching a course called Imagining America right now. And I started with The Searchers by John Ford, actually. That is sort of appalling, but also wonderfully made film, right? And its racial politics. And I'm teaching Fenimore Cooper as well. And now I've mentioned him in passing in That Freedom's Limit, but I think he's going to make a bigger appearance in one of my next books. And Fenimore Cooper makes to me clearer what's at stake here, right? Because the figure of Natty Bumppo, also known as Pathfinder, also known as the Deer Slayer, also known as all these other things, right? Who's also in Lost of the Mohicans, is, self-consciously unlettered in a way that is in opposition to the British, right? But he's also what D.H. Lawrence called the cold stoic killer, right? And so, I think that differentiation has everything to do with a certain kind of Protestant origin. I'm thinking also of Bermuda's, fleeing the prelate's rage and so on. There's a certain kind of self-authorizing authenticity in a certain Protestant move that we get in post-Reformation, we certainly get in a certain Puritan, in a certain line of Puritan thinking. And I think that Cooper picks it up and transfers it into, and that becomes one of the elements in Pathfinder and this character. And because I've never understood until these last few months where this, oh shucks, I'm just an ordinary guy, but I sometimes have to kill because who else is going to do it, that you see all over American pop culture also, where it comes from. And of course, American historians have written about it. Slotkin has like 3 volumes sitting right behind me, right? Huge volumes about that, Gunfighter Nation, Regeneration Through Violence. So I think that there's interesting, and I think that also speaks to one of the first questions that was addressed to me, right? About my use of the word accessibility and the working class, right? Like, are you just missing the working class in here? I don't actually think that the American critique of elitism has to do with democracy and the working class. Right. I think it has to do with putting up boundaries around human thinking, right, to serve capital and violence. I actually think that. And I think the assumption that the working class is incapable of sophisticated thought and the systematic production of a working class that has been taught to be suspicious of complex sentences, right? Because those are elitist and liberal in Hollywood and whatever else they're supposed to be, actually comes out of a very complex genealogy in American thinking.
They're certainly not Hollywood,
Sadia. Well, that too. I'm not gonna. I'm merely ventriloquizing, but yes, absolutely. So I mean, I actually think that I don't buy that this is about democracy in that sense. I actually think it's coming out of a very complex project. It's coming out of the American project, and we need to rethink that project very carefully.
Yeah, I'm wondering, what you say about the working class. It's interesting that President Biden in his inauguration returned to the theme of the middle class, which of course had been the standard abiding theme. It is an entirely mythical category. But in the Trump era, we had the working class for the first time, as the great referent of American politics. And it made me think when it started happening that, well, if the working class has become a referent for American politics, it must also have, it must also no longer exist. And it's what you were saying in a way, Sadia. In some senses, the post-industrial economy, the virtualization of and financialization of the economy and its globalization has really, can we really talk about a working class in America in any serious way, in any conventionally serious way? What does it mean for people involved at the lower end of a service economy these are not industrial workers, they are not a proletariat, what are they exactly? And perhaps this is one of the things that is roiling American political and social life today, that we have an utterly globalized elite, and we have no longer a working class of any conventionally defined sort. What exactly do we have? And is it perhaps the absence of these old standbys that has allowed for the apparent recrudescence of racial and other forms of identity to, as it were, take their place? Not that they ever went away, but they seem to have emerged in a much more stentorian fashion, as if to occupy space that was once marked or pigeonholed for some class, no matter how rhetorically defined. And it used to be, as I said, the middle class. And we are back to it in this administration, where that brief moment where it was only Trump who actually talked about the working class. For decades, I think, he's been the first president to talk about it.
I think you're pointing to a real fundamental, sort of schism in American political history or American social history, which I think explains the difficulty the left has had, because the traditional economic base of the left, which was the so-called proletariat, the Marxist proletariat group, the workers and all of that sort of thing, there really isn't, as you say, they're service economy workers, and there isn't a meaningful identity agglomeration around their economic interests. And so now the left has increasingly become defined by the pursuit of individual rights or rights for certain groups. But the dilemma there, politically speaking, in order to inhabit power, you do have to have some sort of a real economic basis for what it is that you're contesting. And so this ideological shift, which doesn't really have money at its center, it has a bunch of ideas at its center, valiant ideas perhaps, but they are just ideas. They're not about the money, is part of what has created this, I think, part of the weakness of the left, that there is no real source of the conservative movement. Of course, continues to be the party of property, but what is the left?
But I think that also, and then we're going to wrap up with our last question because we've got 5 minutes or thereabouts left. But I think it's also that, at the very fundamental level, right? I mean, when there was, and I think Trump was using working class as a kind of, as a dog whistle, honestly, right? Because the white working class was, became the working class such as it was, even though it doesn't have much of a space in American political life just because of the nature of American liberalism. But at the same time, it's also been that there's always been this kind of class versus race, right? And so the Latino and Black working class, for instance, and their the non-white working class never gets called the working class in the same way, right? But just because of the way that those axes actually work. Right. So, I mean, I work, and I said earlier when, before we started that, when I think of my campus where I teach as a working class campus, among other things, right. But it's also a largely non-white campus. And I know that registers with people oddly. And even when I say it, because that's not the lingo in America, it registers oddly. But, service industry and so on, or gig economy increasingly also, but to what I think of as the economic basis. But there's not really a kind of encompassing language for that, right? So Trump comes along and then suddenly everyone's talking about the white working class, right? And calling that the working class. But, and leftist activists pointed out that there was a real problem in the fact that, the Black and Latino working class, or the taxi drivers who are South Asian and immigrant and so on, were not included in that. Like, what is this working class, right? And the white left kept trying to explain this in terms of working class as white male disenfranchisement, as if the only person who can be called working class in this country is a white male, right? It was really bizarre. So I have views about that, but we're going to wrap up. So there's a question which I'm going to answer quickly on my own, and then I'm going to raise the final one and let you, which is, as immigrants, do you find Americans non-empathetic, and do you think that the response to the that turning back into the families would be a good response to that? And I'm not, but I want to take another question. So I'm just going to be very quick in the answer. Yes, I do find Americans non-empathetic. Not just to immigrants, but to everybody else in the rest of the planet. I mean, and all you have to do is turn on CNN and watch the news and watch Americans address the world on repeat when they only talk about themselves. Like, when Pulitzer will say, here I am, and let me talk to the, and to Americans and the world watching. And then all we do is talk about America. Right. And it's a kind of narcissism that's mind-boggling if you know anything about what's going on in the rest of the world. I don't think the family response, turning back into the family, is necessarily the response. In fact, I think that neoliberalism, is very much about the family. In fact, there's a kind of pregnant weight with which Americans refer to the family. Right. And I've been tracking that in Hollywood films. It has a lot to do with Margaret Thatcher, in my view, when she said there's no such thing as society, there's only the individual, and then there's a clause that people forget, and the family, right? So the point is that the question is, how do you turn all your interest into how do you make it the smallest atom or the smallest unit, right? And how do you turn it all inward? So what we do is, the world's ending, there's the War of the Worlds. Tom Cruise is only concerned about getting his daughter to Boston or whatever the film was. I don't know, but there's no concept of the world and the social as the world, in my view, in America. But then I am also not a very redemptive and empathetic person myself, clearly. But I will read the final question. Sorry, guys, I mean, I just because we're literally over time. And this is, I found the question you just raised about how not to participate in grievance as the basis of identity formation in America a fascinating one. The narrator in Homeland Elegies reflects at some point on the fact that he had willingly, quote, participated in his own exclusion, end of quote, by choosing to see himself as other, in quotes, in America. What might it have meant for him to choose differently? How and where else can such an alternate, unalienated self-perception be nourished if society holds up a mirror that insists that we see ourselves as we are seen? Ayad, this is for you, and you get the last word.
What a brilliant question.
Yes.
I think that the book was a kind of sort of inevitable response to a whole series of emotional upheavals in my life and politically within the country. And I think one of the conditions of me being able to write it was to kind of finally recognize that the question of belonging was not going to get solved, and that none of these questions were going to get solved. And that the position of being an outsider within my own society was perhaps not that bad a thing after all. And that being an artist and being an observer was really not structurally any different from being excluded from the sort of dominant majority. And that if I could just let go of the longing for that, that maybe I could find a kind of belonging in the act of observing and relating. And so I suppose, the very, very far-reaching question that the questioner has asked, I don't have an answer for because I don't see another choice, at least for myself. And it turns out that that's great. That's turned out just fine.
I think that that's a great moment to end. I don't know what we agreed. Am I ending this? Is Jill ending? Jill, do you want a last word, or?
No, I think we ended, or maybe you ended for us, Sadia.
Oh, well, thank you so much, and thank you for inviting us to speak. Thank you for including me and Faisal.
Thank you for having me.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, everybody, and have a good evening.